I used to tell people that if they did not believe every single word of the Bible, every jot and tittle, then they were calling God a liar. And I wasn't quiet about that. I argued for that, I defended that, and in many respects I built my entire faith upon that. Because for me, it was simple. Either God lies or God tells the truth. And even if one verse was wrong in the Bible, then the whole thing would collapse. But what I didn't know at that time was that there was one small detail in the Bible that would eventually dismantle all of that certainty all at once. And that one small detail was going to force me to rebuild everything from the ground up. And if you're somewhere in the middle of deconstruction right now, there's a pretty good chance that you know exactly what I'm talking about. You might even recognize exactly how I got there. So here's the story of my deconstruction, the story of how I went from being a fundamentalist to a liberal. Yes, I was a fundamentalist. I wasn't there for very long, but I was definitely there. I was convicted right to the core. I believed the Bible was inerrant, without error, in every single word of it. And the logic that felt airtight to me went something like this. If the Bible is God's word and God cannot lie, then the Bible cannot contain any contradictions. Full stop. So when someone would say something to me like, I just don't think that's true, what I heard was, God is unreliable. Now, what I didn't realize at the time was that this was actually a fear reaction, because certainty had become the foundation of my faith, and I was erecting this intellectual construct in order to protect it. And back then, in order to build up my defenses, I read constantly. I read book after book after book, but mostly authors who reinforced my fundamentalist perspective. And here's the thing that was doomed to trip me up eventually. You see, I didn't know who was who in the wider world of biblical scholarship, and that meant I could not easily identify who was in my school of thought and who was not. And so, without meaning to, I picked up someone well outside of my framework. I believe it was Hans Kung who revealed to me the problem. And the problem was this: how many horses did Solomon have? Because according to 1 Kings, it says that he has 40,000. But according to 2 Chronicles, it's only 4,000. So here's the thing about that. This is not something that I could reconcile. You see, if we were talking about someone going up to a city in one passage or down to a city in another passage, I could look at that and I could say, well, that sort of makes sense because they were going south, but they were going up a hill, and therefore they were going up to the city and down to the city at the same time. But in this case, this is a horse count. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't symbolism. This is a very specific number. And according to my very basic math, 4,000 does not equal 40,000. This was impossible for me to harmonize without an extreme feat of creativity that would obviously be nothing short of laughable. And so I had to ask myself an extremely uncomfortable question. If the Bible has one single contradiction in it, what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. The Bible then can have more contradictions in it. And after diving further into this whole thing, lo and behold, I discovered that there were a ton of them. And the good news is in this that my faith did not collapse. Instead, this realization was incredibly liberating for me because it allowed my insatiable curiosity to take over. And because once that wall cracked, I could finally read the Bible with intellectual honesty. And once you read honestly, you start to see even more and more and more. And by the way, I create videos like this for progressive Christians, questioners, and the church alumni. Those people who live on the edge of faith, whether they have left the church behind or they still sit in the pews. But if this is you, I want you to know that you are in the right place. So please like and subscribe so we can stay connected. Once I allowed contradictions to exist in the Bible, something shifted. You see, the Bible stopped being this holy relic or this untouchable museum piece, and instead it became a human document, just like those liberals said it was. And that realization intrigued me. Because you see, I now wanted to know what those liberal Christians thought about things. And so I started reading other Christians, most especially John Shelby Spong. And I read his books like Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, Living in Sin, Resurrection, Myth or Reality. And I'm going to put links to these in the description. But what I discovered was that the biblical texts reflected the social and religious worlds in which they were written. And that means the Bible rubber-stamped things like ancient patriarchy, ancient purity codes, ancient marriage structures. But here's the problem with that. We don't live in the ancient world. We live in a modern world. And the ancient answers don't always work for modern issues. And that leads us to the hot button issue of the day during the time that I was deconverting in the very late 90s. Should Christians stand for or against the full inclusion of gays and lesbians in the church and society? You see, what I had realized was that the ancient world did not have our modern understanding of sexual orientation. It couldn't conceptualize of lifelong, mutual, covenantal, same-sex relationships that in the same way that we do today. In other words, the texts are incapable of answering a question if the question is one that the text can't even conceive of. And that insight completely changed my posture on the issue, and I converted. I stopped defending a system, and I started listening to people. And once you start listening, you find that that certainty that you once had really starts to soften, and more importantly, your heart starts to soften. And as a result, I became an advocate of full LGBTQ inclusion in the church and the world as a matter of justice. I went from being a fundamentalist to an arch-liberal, not because I had abandoned the Bible, but because I stopped pretending that the Bible transcended history. When you enter into deconstruction, here's something that nobody tells you. When your view of Scripture changes, your view of God eventually follows. I had always believed in God as more like a theistic God. You know, this is the God who is out there. This is the God who is watching. This is the God who is intervening in history, moving things around. This is a God who is separate from the world, but related to the world. Then I encountered a new understanding of God called panentheism. Not pantheism, but panentheism. There's an en right in the middle of that. And this is the idea that everything exists within God. This is the God that permeates all of reality and yet is still somehow more than reality. And one of the ways that panentheist theologians describe God is as the ground of all being. Now, I didn't really get the significance of what that meant until one night. I was standing outside under a beautiful full autumn moon. The cold air was all around, there was quiet, and the lamps lit the pavement outside of my seminary housing. And then I took a moment and I imagined God in that old way, the God that's out there, that's distant. And then I closed my eyes and I asked, what if instead this moment is happening within God? What if the air that I'm breathing is already sacred? Now, I didn't see anything different. I didn't hear anything different. But the experience shifted for me. And suddenly, God wasn't out there any longer. God was the depth right here in that moment. And once I experienced that shift, I could not go back. And that is how I started deconstructing God. But my deconstruction did not stop there. Eventually, I ran into a theologian named John Caputo, and the first book of his that I read was Against Ethics. And again, I'll put the link down in the description in case you want to get it. And his theology pushed me even farther than I had gone up to this point. For Caputo, you see, God does not exist, but rather God insists. So God doesn't exist like a chair exists. God is not a supernatural agent intervening in history, but rather God insists like love insists, like a summons toward justice, toward mercy, toward courage. And initially, this idea both confused and really unsettled me. Because now faith wasn't about proving something metaphysical. It was about responding. And you see, when you feel pulled toward compassion, that is the insistence of God. When you feel summoned to bring healing where there has been harm, now that is the insistence of God. When you feel like you should forgive, but you just really do not want to, that is the insistence of God. And in this new theology, God ceased to be something to defend anymore. And instead, God became a pressure toward transformation. And the school of theology that John Caputo fits into is called radical theology. And today, I consider myself to be an armchair radical theologian, which is a long way from where I started on this journey. Here's what I wish someone had told me earlier. Spiritual deconstruction isn't like a cliff. It's not like you fall off of it once and you're done with it. No, it's not. It's a cycle. You dismantle something, you grieve that loss, and then you rebuild something that's more honest. And then one day, something happens, and you dismantle it all over again, and then you rebuild it all over again. And then later, you go through the same process again and again. And sometimes, quite frankly, it feels like no matter what you do, you just can't get it right, no matter how many times you go through it. And this is something I really need to emphasize here. Going through this process isn't a sign that you're failing spiritually. This is just what spiritual growth looks like. And here's something that you learn as you keep going through the process. Certainty may feel powerful when your mindset is right there. But in actuality, it is humility that is durable. And what you don't know before you enter into deconstruction is that every phase of reconstruction leaves you far more grounded than the previous one. So here I am, one foot inside Christianity and the other outside. I am part of what is called the church alumni, part of those people who no longer believe what the institution typically teaches. But I didn't leave it. I am still in it. And part of my personal mission while here is to carve out a space for myself and for those who love the Christian tradition but just refuse to pretend any longer. And here's the irony of all of this. I really did used to say that if you don't believe every word of the Bible, then you're calling God a liar. And now I think that God doesn't have to collapse if you see all those inconsistencies in the Bible. But the demand for certainty, that certainly will. And that is a good thing. Because you see, faith never, ever should have been about defending perfection in the first place. It should always have been about responding to the insistence toward love. And if you've been through deconstruction, I just got to ask, what was the crack on the wall that started it all for you? Was it a contradiction like it was for me? Was it a social issue? Was it some sort of a personal wound? Or maybe it could have been this doubt that you just really could not unsee. Please tell me in the comments, because one of the worst parts of the experience of deconstruction is this feeling that you are the only one going through it. And if that's how you feel right now, I want you to hear this truth. You are not alone. And if you've made it this far, please like and subscribe so that we can stay connected. I'm Bo McGuffey of the Evolving Christian Faith Network. Until next time, peace.